candles had already burned low by the time they dressed me in my sister's gown. I remember the smell of it, lavender and something sharper underneath, like fear soaked into the fabric over weeks of anticipation. Seraphine had worn it every evening for fittings, turning slowly before the copper mirror in our chamber, while our mother clasped her hands and murmured prayers of gratitude to the old gods. The gown was cream-colored wool, embroidered at the collar with silver thread, fitted at the waist with a belt of braided leather. It had been made for her. Every stitch, every careful measurement, every whispered hope sewn into the hem, all of it for Seraphine, not for me. I was Clara, the second daughter, the one who carried water from the well before dawn, and ground the grain when the millboy was ill, and sat quietly in corners during feasts, because no one thought to save me a seat closer to the fire. I was not unkind, and I was not unintelligent, but I was invisible in the particular way that second daughters learn to be invisible, not by choice, but by the slow, steady erosion of being overlooked so many times that you begin to believe you deserve it. And yet, on the morning of the winter solstice, in the year that King Roman of the Lycan territories sent his envoy to claim his promised bride, it was my name they called. Seraphine had run. No one said it plainly. Our mother spoke of a sudden illness, a fever that came in the night, a fragile constitution unsuited for the northern cold. Lord Aldrich, our father, stood with his back to the window and said nothing at all, which was worse. The envoy, a broad-shouldered beta named Gregor with a jaw like a stone wall and eyes that missed nothing, looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the space where Seraphine was not standing. "The treaty requires a daughter of House Valen," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had delivered worse news than this, and would deliver worse still, before he died. "The king will have his bride before the new moon. Is there another?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 heartbeats. I counted them. Then my mother turned to look at me. I want to tell you that I protested, that I drew myself up and said something sharp and clear and brave about the injustice of being offered as a replacement for a sister who had the luxury of fear when I did not. But the truth is that I looked at my father's face, pale, exhausted, the face of a man calculating the cost of refusal against the weight of a treaty with the most powerful Lycan King in living memory. And I understood before anyone spoke. There was no other daughter. There was only me. "Don't cry," I told myself, in that firm interior voice I had developed over years of swallowing things that deserved to be wept over. "Don't you dare cry in front of him." So I didn't. I said, "I will go." And the words came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Gregor studied me with those careful eyes. He was not cruel. I would learn that later. But he was thorough. He catalogued my plain linen dress, my work-roughened hands, the practical braid my hair fell in because I had never learned the elaborate styles my sister favored. He noted that I was not Seraphine, not her particular shade of honey gold that caught candlelight like something precious, not her practiced grace, not her curated softness. I was blonder, lighter, with eyes the gray-green of still water and a frame built more for carrying and less for being carried. I was, in every visible sense, the lesser daughter. But he nodded. And that was how it began. The journey north took 6 days. I spent most of them with my forehead against the cold wooden panel of the covered cart, watching the landscape change from the familiar rolling farmland of Valen's lowlands to something older and less forgiving. The trees grew taller and closer together. The road, where there was a road, became a suggestion more than a certainty. Narrow, frost-hardened, flanked by snow that had settled weeks ago and showed no intention of leaving. The sky was the particular gray of pewter left to tarnish, heavy and low, pressing down on everything beneath it. Gregor rode ahead. 2 guards flanked the cart. No one spoke to me unless I asked a direct question, and even then the answers were brief. On the 3rd night, Sheltered at a way station deep in the ashwood, one of the guards, a young beta named Edric, with a patchy beard and honest eyes, brought me a bowl of thick barley soup and lingered longer than was strictly necessary. "Are you frightened, my lady?" he asked. The title caught me strangely. No one had called me that before. My sister was my lady. I was simply Clara. "Yes," I said, because lying seemed wasteful when we were already so far from anything I had ever known. "Is that foolish?" Edric considered this with more seriousness than the question probably deserved. "Most people fear King Roman," he said carefully, "but most people have never actually been near him long enough to understand him." "And you have?" Something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, but a particular kind of careful respect that I would come to recognize in everyone who served within the Lycan court. "I have ridden with him into the Thornwood border conflicts," Edric said. "He fights at the front, not behind. He remembers the names of soldiers who fall." He paused. "He is not what the stories say." "What do the stories say?" I asked, though I already knew. Everyone in the lowlands knew. King Roman of the Lycan territories, the unbroken king, the cold sovereign, the alpha who had consolidated 3 warring Lycan packs under a single crown through a combination of force, political precision, and a personal ferocity that had become the stuff of fireside tales, told to frighten children into obedience. Edric looked at his soup bowl. "That he doesn't feel things the way others do," he said. "That he chose this treaty marriage for political alliance and nothing more." A brief pause. "That he has never once smiled in court." I absorbed this information and filed it carefully alongside everything else I was trying not to think about. "You are going to be his wife," I thought, very quietly, in the private room of my own mind where no one could hear. "You are going to be a queen in a court where you know no one, wearing your sister's embroidered gown, answering to a name you have not yet decided belongs to you, and the man waiting at the end of this road can shift into a wolf under moonlight and rule 10,000 Lycan warriors with a look. You are absolutely, entirely not ready for this. But you said you would go. So go." Caerwyn Keep rose out of the tree line without warning. I had expected it to announce itself from a distance, the way castles and stories do, visible for miles, gleaming on a hilltop, impressive and welcoming in equal measure. Instead, the forest simply ended, and there it was, a fortress of dark stone built into the side of a granite ridge, wide and low and ancient, with towers that tapered into the gray sky like fingers. Torches burned in iron brackets along the outer wall. Smoke rose from 4 chimneys. A gate of black iron stood open. It was not beautiful, precisely, but it was real in a way that pressed against me like a physical weight. The reality of where I was, of what I had agreed to, of who was waiting inside. I pressed my hands together in my lap and felt the cold of my own fingers. The cart passed through the gate. The inner courtyard was already assembled. Rows of Lycan warriors stood at attention, betas and gammas in leather and fur, bearing the banner of House Caerwyn, a wolf's head on a field of black. Servants had gathered along the walls. A council of gray-robed advisors stood near the great doors, and standing at the top of the stone steps, alone, watching the cart arrive with an expression that gave nothing away at all. King Roman. He was exactly as tall as the stories suggested, and entirely different from them in every way that mattered. His dark hair was braided back in long, tight rows that fell past his shoulders, and his eyes, even from this distance, across the width of the courtyard, were the sharp, particular blue of deep water under winter light. He wore black leather armor with the crossed strap harness of a warrior, a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who believed in uncompromising lines. A faint scar marked his left cheekbone, old, settled, barely visible. He was not smiling. Edric helped me down from the cart. My legs, stiff from 6 days of travel, cooperated with a stubbornness I was grateful for. I straightened my spine, I smoothed the front of Seraphine's borrowed gown. I lifted my chin. And then I looked up at him. He was already looking at me. Not at the cart. Not at Gregor, who had dismounted and was crossing the courtyard toward the steps to make his report. Not at the assembled court or the guards or the banners snapping in the cold wind. At me. And something crossed his face, something too quick and too complicated to name, before the stillness came back and sealed him closed again. I felt my heart do something inconvenient and alarming in my chest. He's going to know immediately, I thought, in that honest private room inside my head, with the helpless clarity of someone who has run completely out of composure. One look at me beside Seraphine's description, and he's going to know I am not who was promised. I am not polished enough, not practiced enough, not anything enough. And then, he is going to send me home, and my father's treaty will dissolve and everything will. King Roman's gaze sharpened. He descended 3 steps. His eyes had not left my face. And for one breathless, impossible moment, I had the distinct and deeply unsettling sensation that he had heard every single word. No one told me that a Lycan King's formal greeting involved standing in open air cold enough to turn breath to mist, while an entire court watched every movement you made. I stood at the base of the stone steps and tried very hard to appear as though I was not acutely aware of every single pair of eyes in that courtyard. The warriors along the walls. The gray-robed advisors with their careful, measuring expressions. The servants pressed against the stones, whispering things too low for human ears, though not, I suspected, too low for Lycan ones. Roman descended the remaining steps with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything, because everything eventually came to him. He stopped 2 paces away. This close, he was more overwhelming than he had been from across the courtyard, which I would not have thought possible. He smelled of pine resin and cold iron and something underneath both. Something warmer and less definable, like hearthstone on a winter night. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are not Seraphine Valen." It was not a question. His voice was low, unhurried, with the faint northern inflection of someone who had grown up where the winters were long and words were spent carefully. Around us, the courtyard went very still. I held his gaze. My heart was performing extraordinary feats of misbehavior inside my chest. But my voice, when it came, was level. "No," I said. "I am Clara, her sister." A breath. "House Valen sends its apologies and assures the crown that the terms of the treaty remain fully honored. A daughter of Valen blood stands before you." Silence. Someone in the row of advisors coughed quietly. Roman studied me with those blue eyes that seemed to operate at a different depth than ordinary looking, as though he were not simply observing my face but reading something beneath it, some interior text I had not consented to share. It was profoundly uncomfortable. I resisted the urge to look away, because looking away felt like conceding something I could not afford to concede. He is going to refuse, I thought, in the clear, honest voice of my own mind. He is going to refuse and send me back, and I will ride 6 days through the ashwood with nothing to show for it but the memory of his eyes and the cold. And that will be that. And perhaps that is fine. Perhaps that is better. Roman's jaw shifted slightly. A muscle worked near his temple, the only indication that anything was happening inside that composed exterior. Then he said, "Come inside," turned, and walked back up the steps. Not a refusal, not quite an acceptance either, but an opening, which was more than I had expected. I followed him. They gave me a chamber in the east wing, 2 floors above the great hall, with a narrow window that looked out over the ridge and the forest beyond. It was not a guest chamber, too well appointed for that, with a proper hearth and a carved oak wardrobe and bed curtains in deep gray wool. It was, I realized slowly as a maidservant named Berta helped me out of Seraphine's traveling gown, a permanent chamber. Someone had anticipated an occupant. The king's steward had it prepared 3 weeks past, Berta offered, as though she had heard my unspoken question. She was a stout woman, middle-aged, with the warm efficiency of someone who had kept order in a large household for many years. She said things plainly, and without apology, which I immediately appreciated. New linens. Firewood brought up this morning. The window latch was stiff. One of the carpenters came to fix it yesterday. He prepared for a wife, I said, more to myself than to her. Berta smoothed the front of a fresh linen kirtle she was helping me into, practical and clean, in a warm cream color. He prepared for a Valen bride, she corrected mildly. Whether or not the right one arrived is a matter the king will settle in his own time and his own way. I absorbed this while she plaited my hair, the same simple style I always wore, a long braid over one shoulder, because I did not know any other way to arrange it, and she did not suggest one. In the copper mirror on the wall, I looked exactly as I always looked, plain, composed, slightly too honest in the eyes. The gray woolen cloak I had worn on the journey was draped over a chair. My worn leather satchel sat near the wardrobe. Everything I owned fit in that satchel. You are going to be a queen, I thought, looking at my reflection with a bluntness that bordered on unkind. Look at you. A knock at the door interrupted whatever further verdict my reflection was about to deliver. Berta opened it to reveal a young man I had not yet met, perhaps 17, dark-haired, with the restless energy of someone who moved through the world at a faster speed than it was designed for. He had Roman's jaw, softer with youth, and bright gray eyes that were currently doing the very uncourtly thing of looking at me with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "You're the substitute bride," he said cheerfully. "Finn." Berta's voice carried a specific weight. "What?" Everyone's saying it. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and continued his thorough assessment of me without any visible embarrassment. "I'm Finn, the king's younger brother. Well, half-brother. It's complicated. Are you actually from Valen's lowlands? You don't look like I expected." "What did you expect?" I asked. He tilted his head. Seraphine Valen's description was sent ahead with the envoy. Golden hair, green eyes, trained in court manners, educated in 3 languages, accomplished in the harp. He paused. "You have the golden hair." "I have the hair," I agreed. Something in my dry delivery apparently delighted him, because he grinned, sudden and genuine, with a gap between his front teeth, and the restless energy settled into something warmer. "I think you'll do better than expected," he said, as though this were both a compliment and a verdict he had the authority to render. "Finn," Berta said again, with more weight. I'm going. He pushed off the doorframe, then paused. "Dinner in the great hall is at sundown. Roman always sits at the high table. He won't come to fetch you, so don't wait for it. Just come down." A brief assessing look. "And, for what it's worth, he didn't send you back. With Roman, that means something." Then he was gone, his boots quick and uneven on the stone corridor outside. I stood for a moment in the quiet he left behind. He didn't send you back. I thought about Roman's face on the steps. The way something had moved through his expression before the stillness sealed over it again. The way his eyes had sharpened at exactly the moment my most panicked thoughts had reached their loudest point inside my own head. A cold, specific thought formed at the base of my skull. I turned to Berta. "The king," I said carefully. "What are his gifts, as an alpha Lycan?" I knew the general lore, the strength, the speed, the shift. But Lycan alphas sometimes carried additional abilities, particular gifts that ran through bloodlines. It was not secret knowledge. It was simply not the kind of thing discussed openly in Valen's lowlands, where Lycan territory was far enough away to remain mostly theoretical. Berta smoothed the wardrobe latch with 2 fingers. A small pause, the pause of someone deciding how much truth to offer. His father could track a man across 3 kingdoms by scent alone, she said finally. His mother was said to feel the emotions of those near her, like heat from a candle. She folded a wool blanket at the foot of the bed with the neat precision of long habit. Roman's gift is different, more specific. She stopped. Berta? I said. She looked at me. Something in her face was almost apologetic. He hears thoughts, she said quietly. Not all thoughts, and not from everyone. The gift has limits we do not fully understand. But those who stand very close to him, or those whose emotions run very high. She smoothed the blanket one final time. It is why he is so difficult to deceive, and why his court learned long ago to keep a still mind in his presence. The room was very quiet. Outside the narrow window, the gray sky had begun to darken toward evening, and the first torches along the outer wall were being lit one by one, their orange light wavering in the cold wind. He heard me, I thought, with a certainty that settled into my bones like frost, in the courtyard. When I was standing there thinking every terrified, honest, helpless thought I could not stop myself from thinking, he heard all of it, every word, every fear, every small, humiliating admission. The warmth that flooded my face had nothing to do with the hearth fire. This, I thought, with a kind of exhausted, helpless clarity, is going to be a problem. Dinner in the great hall was not what I had braced for. I had imagined something formal and watched, every movement scrutinized, every bite evaluated, every silence weighed against the template of the bride who had not come. I had prepared myself. On the walk down from the east wing, with Berta's quiet guidance through the castle's stone corridors, for the particular discomfort of being examined and found insufficient. What I found instead was noise. The great hall of Caerwyn Keep smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat, and the sharp green scent of pine branches that had been laid along the windowsills in some gesture toward winter celebration. Long trestle tables ran the length of the room, packed with Lycan warriors and household staff, eating together with a democratic informality that surprised me. Betas shoulder to shoulder with gammas, guards laughing with stable hands, a pair of enormous wolfhounds asleep under the nearest table with the sovereign confidence of animals who had never been told they were not welcome. At the high table on the raised dais, Roman sat at the center. He was not eating yet. He had a goblet of dark wine near his hand, and a parchment scroll weighted open on the table before him, and he was speaking to a gray-bearded advisor on his left with the focused economy of someone conducting actual work in the middle of what everyone else understood to be a meal. Finn sat 3 seats to his right, already deep in conversation with a red-haired gamma warrior and eating with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who had never worried about appearances. I paused at the edge of the dais. Roman looked up. Across the noise and the candlelight and the distance, his eyes found me immediately, the way a compass finds north, without effort, without searching. I walked to the high table and took the empty seat that logic indicated was mine. To Roman's right, across from the gray-bearded advisor. A servant appeared immediately with wine and bread. Finn leaned forward from his end of the table and offered me a wave that managed to be both welcoming and slightly conspiratorial. Roman set down the scroll. "Clara Valen," he said. Not a greeting exactly. More like confirmation, as though he were testing how the name settled. "Your Grace," I replied. A pause in which I was acutely, burningly aware that I had no idea what was happening inside his head, while he almost certainly had a perfectly clear accounting of what was happening inside mine. Stop thinking so loudly, I told myself, which was, of course, the most useless instruction I had ever given. The corner of Roman's mouth, just barely, just for the space of one unguarded moment, moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller. Something that arrived and disappeared so quickly that I might have imagined it entirely, except that I was watching his face, with the close, helpless attention of someone who had absolutely nothing else safe to look at. He lifted his goblet. "Welcome to Caerwyn," he said quietly, in the voice meant only to carry as far as me. And for reasons I did not entirely understand and refused to examine too closely, that small, careful sentence felt like something more than courtesy. It felt like the beginning of something. I did not sleep well that first night. The bed was warmer than anything I had known in Valen's lowlands. Deep wool blankets, a proper feather mattress. The hearth kept fed through the night by some unseen hand that came and went without waking me. It was not discomfort that kept me from sleep. It was the particular restlessness of a mind that refuses to quiet itself when quiet is what it most needs. I lay on my back and stared at the dark canopy above me, and thought about Roman's face in the moment before courtesy reassembled itself over whatever had briefly crossed it. I thought about Berta's careful, apologetic voice, saying he hears thoughts. I thought about the way his eyes had found me across the great hall without any visible effort. The way a hound finds a scent. Not hunting, exactly, but knowing. He has heard everything, I thought. Every frightened, unguarded, embarrassing thing you have thought since the cart passed through that gate. He knows you are terrified. He knows you feel like a borrowed thing wearing your sister's embroidered hem. He knows you looked at him and felt something you have no business feeling toward a man who did not choose you. This last thought arrived with enough force that I pressed my hands flat against the blankets and made a deliberate, concentrated effort to think about absolutely nothing, which worked for approximately 4 seconds. Then I thought, what does a Lycan King do with the private fears of a woman he never asked for? No answer came. Only the wind outside the ridge, moving through the pine trees with a sound like breathing, and the soft collapse of a log in the hearth. Eventually, somewhere deep in the night, I slept. Morning in Caerwyn Keep arrived with the bells. Not church bells. The kingdom had its own ritual calendar, marked by deep iron bells hung in the tower above the gate, which rang at dawn and at the watch changes and at intervals throughout the day that I had not yet learned to read. Their sound was low and resonant, felt more in the chest than heard by the ears, and it pulled me upright before I had consciously decided to wake. Berta arrived shortly after with warm water for washing and a fresh kirtle in gray wool, warmer than the cream one, practical for the northern cold, along with the information that the king broke his fast in the war chamber at first light, and that I was not expected to attend. Household matters fell under the steward's authority until formal arrangements were settled. I was, for the moment, in a comfortable and deeply ambiguous position. Neither fully guest nor fully mistress, with no clear role, and no one yet to tell me what one looked like here. "What does a Lycan queen do?" I asked Berta, while she plaited my hair in the familiar single braid over my shoulder. Berta considered this. Queen Marin, Roman's mother, managed the household accounts and the stores. She settled disputes among the servants. She received petitions from the village women when the steward was unavailable. A pause. She also rode with the king on the border inspections in the early years. Did she? She was a strong woman, Berta said simply. Not Lycan herself. She was beta-born from the eastern provinces, but she understood the court. I watched my reflection absorb this. And what happened to her? Berta's hand stilled briefly on the end of the braid, then continued. She passed in the winter fever 7 years past. Roman was 23. Another pause, shorter. He did not speak of it openly, but the court felt the change in him afterward. He became... She searched for the word. More contained. I thought of the stillness in his face, the way expression moved through it briefly, and then was sealed away again, like something valuable being locked behind a door that knew how to close without sound. He learned to keep things inside, I thought. The way I did. The way people do when showing their feelings has cost them something they could not afford to lose. I caught myself having this thought and immediately felt the absurdity of it. Sitting in a castle in the far north, braiding my hair, constructing theories of emotional kinship with a man who was, by every reasonable measure, the most formidable creature in the known territories. I stood up, smoothed my skirts, and went to find the kitchens. If I could not yet define my role in this court, I could at least be useful. The kitchens of Caerwyn Keep were vast and loud, and smelled of bread and rendered fat, and the iron-sharp edge of winter herbs. Dried lavender and rosemary in bunches along the rafters, a barrel of salt near the main hearth, a pair of kitchen boys turning a spit with the mechanical persistence of people who had learned not to complain. The head cook was a broad woman named Marta, who looked at me when I appeared in the doorway with an expression that moved rapidly through surprise, confusion, and then a carefully neutral assessment. "My lady," she said, with the particular flatness of someone who was not sure the title applied, but was not willing to risk omitting it. "I thought I might help," I said, "if there's something useful to be done." The silence that followed was the silence of a kitchen that had just collectively looked up from its work. Marta set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She crossed her arms. She looked at me for a long moment with the evaluating precision of a woman who had spent 30 years running a keep's provisions and had learned to assess usefulness quickly and accurately. "Can you bone a game bird?" she asked. "Yes. Do you know how to preserve with salt or smoke?" "Both." A pause. "Can you read?" This question asked with the careful neutrality of someone for whom the answer might go either way. "Yes, and I can keep figures." Marta uncrossed her arms. She handed me a spare apron from the hook near the door and pointed to the far workbench where 3 plucked pheasants lay waiting with the resigned air of their kind. "Then start with those," she said. "And try not to let the scullery boys intimidate you. They're mostly noise." I tied the apron. I picked up the knife. I went to work. It was the most comfortable I had felt since leaving Valen. I was still in the kitchens 2 hours later, the pheasants long since dealt with, graduated now to sorting dried legumes and recording the remaining winter stores in the supply ledger that Marta had produced from beneath a flour sack, with the air of someone surrendering a private treasure. When the kitchen went quiet in a specific, collective, immediate way that was entirely different from the ordinary pauses of busy work, I looked up. Roman stood in the kitchen doorway. He was still in his armor, or most of it, the fur mantle absent, the leather chest piece worn and practical. And he had clearly come directly from the war chamber, or somewhere equally purposeful. He was not looking at Marta, or at the kitchen boys who had frozen mid-task. He was looking at me, standing at the far workbench with flour on my hands and an apron tied over my gray kirtle, and the supply ledger open in front of me. His expression was, I had not yet learned to read his expressions with any confidence, but this one seemed to contain something that might have been surprise, if surprise were something he allowed himself. "Your Grace," Marta said, recovering first. She moved toward him with the automatic deference of long habit. "Is there something—" "Leave us," he said, not unkindly, but with the complete, unquestioned authority of someone who had never once had to say a thing twice. The kitchen emptied with remarkable efficiency. Marta ushered the boys out through the side passage. The girl who had been washing pots set them down without sound and was gone. Within 30 seconds, the vast, warm, cluttered space contained only the 2 of us, and the fire and the smell of bread still rising in the iron ovens. I set down the ledger carefully. I did not untie the apron, because untying the apron would require looking down, and I had the strong instinct that looking down was the wrong thing to do. Roman crossed the kitchen. He stopped on the opposite side of the workbench, 3 feet of scrubbed oak between us, and looked at the ledger, then at my flour-dusted hands, then at my face. "You were cataloging the winter stores," he said. "The supply record had not been updated since the harvest count," I said. "Marta mentioned it. I offered to help." A silence. "You know how to keep supply records." My father's steward was old and his eyesight was going. Someone had to take over the accounts. I kept my voice even. I am not trained for court. I know that. But I know how to be useful, and I would rather be useful than... I stopped. Then what? He asked. Than sit in that chamber and think too loudly where you can hear me, I thought, with the helpless honesty of a mind that had not yet developed the skill of keeping quiet. Something shifted in Roman's expression. There it was. That fractional change, a deepening, a recognition, that confirmed what Berta had told me and what I had already suspected. He had heard it. He heard it the way one hears a bell that has been rung in an adjacent room, clearly, completely, without any effort on the listener's part. I felt the heat climb my neck and pressed my flour-covered hands flat against the workbench surface. I apologize, I said very quietly. I am told I think too. Don't, he said. I stopped. His voice had been low, and the word had come quickly enough to suggest something behind it that his composure was working to contain. Don't apologize for it, he said, more deliberately this time, each word placed with care. He looked at the ledger on the workbench rather than at me, and I had the sense of watching someone choose their footing on uncertain ground. Most people in this court learned long ago to keep their thoughts smooth and empty in my presence. A pause. Like still water over stone. That sounds very lonely, I said before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the bread rising in the oven. Roman looked up from the ledger. His eyes, this close, were a more complicated blue than they appeared from across a courtyard. Not simply the sharp winter water color I had noted first, but layered, deeper, with something guarded at the center that I recognized the way you recognize a landscape you have never seen, but somehow know. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, the council meets this afternoon to discuss the terms of the treaty and whether the substitution constitutes a fulfillment of the original agreement. He said it with the clean directness of someone returning to solid ground. You should be present. They will have questions. I understand, I said. He nodded once, turned to go. Roman, I said. He stilled. I did not know why I had used his name. It arrived before the more cautious version of myself could redirect it to your grace or my lord, or any of the safer, more appropriate forms. It simply came out. His name, plain, the way I thought of him in that honest interior room where I could not seem to help myself. He turned back slightly, not fully. A 3/4 turn, one hand at his side. I will not pretend to be something I am not in front of your council, I said. I want you to know that before we go in. I am not Seraphine. I cannot perform her version of this. I can only be what I am. A breath. Whatever that is worth. The silence stretched between us like something being measured. I know what you are, Roman said quietly. Then he walked out of the kitchen, and I stood in the warm, flower-scented air and tried very hard not to examine what, exactly, that had meant. The council chamber smelled of tallow candles and old parchment, and the particular tension of men who had already formed their opinions before walking through the door. There were 7 of them seated around the long oak table when Roman led me in. Advisors and lords of the Lycan court, ranging from Lord Aldwyn, the gray-bearded man I had noticed at dinner, to a sharp-faced woman named Lady Cressida, who held the seat of the eastern border territories, and looked at me with the precise, unhurried assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime identifying weaknesses in things presented to her as strengths. Finn sat along the wall, not at the table, an observer's position, which he occupied with his characteristic restless energy, one knee bouncing faintly beneath the bench. Gregor, the envoy who had collected me from Valen, stood near the window with his arms folded, and the carefully neutral expression of a man who understood that he was at least partially responsible for the current situation. I took the seat Roman indicated, to his right, at the head of the table, and folded my hands in my lap, and kept my spine straight and my face composed. They are going to decide whether you are acceptable, I told myself. Whether a second daughter from the lowlands constitutes a fulfillment of a treaty written with a first daughter in mind. Whether any of this is legally and politically sufficient. A pause in my own interior voice. And Roman is sitting close enough to hear every word of this, which means you need to stop narrating your own situation quite so thoroughly. At the far end of the table, I caught the ghost of something crossing Roman's face. Lord Aldwin opened a scroll and cleared his throat with the authority of a man who had spent decades making procedural sounds that commanded silence. The matter before this council, he said, is the question of treaty fulfillment. The agreement between Crown Caerwyn and House Valen specifies a daughter of Valen blood as bride to his grace. The question is whether the substitution of the second daughter for the first constitutes a breach, said Lady Cressida, without waiting for Aldwin to finish his sentence. Her voice was precise as a blade. She had dark eyes and silver-streaked hair pinned beneath a circlet of plain iron, and she looked at me without hostility, but with the cool thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. The treaty names Seraphine Valen. The woman present is Clara Valen. These are not the same name. They are the same blood, Gregor said, from the window. Blood satisfies the lineage clause, Aldwin allowed. The question is the intent clause. Was it the intent of the agreement to secure any daughter, or a specific daughter? The room considered this with the weighted silence of people who already knew the answer they preferred, and were constructing the architecture of legitimacy around it. I looked at the table. Say something, I thought. You are sitting here like furniture. You are not furniture. You came 6 days through the ashwood in the cold, and you are not going to sit in this room like something to be decided over without at least speaking on your own behalf. My lady? Aldwin said, with the mild surprise of a man who had not expected the subject of the discussion to have opinions about it. I looked up. Every face at the table turned toward me. Roman, to my left, was watching with an expression I had begun to learn. The stillness that was not absence of feeling, but its careful management. The intent of the agreement, I said, keeping my voice steady, was to create a stable alliance between the Caerwyn crown and House Valen, through a bond of marriage. The specific name in the treaty is a formality of identification, not a condition of the alliance itself. I paused. If the intent were truly to secure Seraphine Valen as a person, rather than a Valen daughter as a symbol of the alliance, the treaty would have been written differently. It was not. Silence. Lady Cressida's eyes sharpened with something that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has just revised an assessment upward. She reads contracts, Gregor said, from the window. There was something in his voice that might have been quiet satisfaction. She keeps supply records as well, Roman said. It was the first time he had spoken since the council began. His voice was even, unhurried, carrying no particular inflection. And yet the table's atmosphere shifted in that subtle way it shifted whenever he chose to speak. Everyone's attention reorganizing itself around his words with the involuntary precision of iron near a lodestone. Lord Aldwin looked at Roman over the rim of his spectacles. Your Grace's position on the substitution? A pause. Roman looked at the table, then at nothing in particular, in the way of someone composing a thought they have already composed, but are choosing to deliver carefully. The alliance stands, he said. The marriage proceeds. Clara Valen is daughter of the house and fulfills the terms. He looked at Aldwin directly. Record it. Aldwin recorded it. Lady Cressida looked at me for one more long moment, then inclined her head in the smallest possible gesture that could still be classified as acknowledgement. I returned it. Finn, along the wall, mouthed something that looked very much like I told you so. What I had not anticipated was that the council would dissolve, and everyone would simply leave with the efficiency of people who had other things to attend to. And I would find myself standing in the corridor outside the chamber, with nowhere particular to be, and no one to guide me there. Roman had been detained by Aldwin at the doorway. Something about the Northern Patrol schedules. Parchments produced and pointed to, with the insistence of someone who had been waiting for an uninterrupted moment. I lingered near the corridor window, watching the courtyard below, where a group of Lycan warriors were running a training drill in the cold gray morning air. Forms I did not recognize, fast and fluid and slightly inhuman in their precision, the kind of movement that reminded you these men were not simply large humans, but something older and more fundamental. You handled that well. I turned. Lady Cressida stood a few paces behind me, her iron circlet level, her dark eyes containing that same cool appraisal they had held throughout the council. Up close, she was perhaps 50, with the weathered competence of a woman who had navigated a great deal of difficult terrain and come out calibrated rather than worn. "I am not sure I handled it," I said. I simply said what seemed accurate. In a council of 7 advisors who had already decided the answer before sitting down, saying what is accurate rather than what is safe is its own form of handling. She looked out at the training yard briefly, then back. "Where did you learn to read contracts?" "My father's steward," I said. "He taught me to read accounts before I was 12. Legal documents were a natural progression." "Your father allowed this?" "My father didn't notice," I said, with more honesty than I had intended. Something moved in Cressida's expression, briefly, like weather crossing open land. "The second daughter," she said quietly, not unkindly. "Always," I agreed. She was silent for a moment. Then, "This court has not had a queen in 7 years. The women of the household have managed without feminine authority at the upper level because they had no other choice. There are matters, petitions, disputes, certain negotiations with the village councils that have gone unattended because they fall outside what the male advisors consider their proper domain." A measured pause. "I raise this not to burden you with it immediately. I raise it because you should know it exists." I looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Cressida held my gaze. "Because you are clearly not what anyone expected," she said. "And in my experience, that is frequently more useful than being exactly what was planned for." She straightened her circlet, which had not moved. "Do not let them make you into furniture, Lady Clara. This court has enough of it." She walked away down the corridor with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had said exactly what she meant and required no response. I turned back to the window. In the training yard below, one of the Lycan warriors had separated from the group and was running the forms alone. Faster than the others, the movement more precise, more contained. It took me a moment to recognize him, because I had not expected to see him there, in the yard, without his fur mantle, working through a combat sequence with the focused intensity of someone not demonstrating, but processing. Roman. He moved through the forms, with a fluidity that was both entirely human and not quite. Something in the speed of the transitions, the absolute economy of each motion. Nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. He had not looked up toward the window. He was not performing. This was private, or as private as anything could be in an open courtyard, and I had the sudden, acute sense of witnessing something not meant for me. I should have looked away. I didn't. 3 days settled into something resembling routine. I learned the bells. I learned that the Great Hall was loudest at midday and quietest in the late afternoon, when the warriors returned from their drills and the keep held its breath before the evening fires were lit. I learned that Marta accepted help without comment, but noticed everything, and that the kitchen boys, Pip and Rafe, ages 14 and 11 respectively, could be bribed into extra efficiency with specific honesty about what the work was for. I began attending the morning petitions. This was not something anyone had assigned me. I had simply appeared in the corridor outside the petition hall on the second morning, having learned from Berta that the steward, A thin, harried man named Oswin received complaints from the household staff and nearby village representatives each morning, and was currently so overrun with winter preparation disputes that the sessions had begun running past midday. I offered to assist. Oswin looked at me with the expression of a man choosing between pride and desperate practicality, and after a moment, practicality won. I sat beside him and took notes. I asked questions when something was unclear. I remembered names. On the third day, a village woman named Hessa came with a dispute about grain allocation. Her family's winter stores had been miscounted in the harvest record, and the difference was significant enough to matter before spring. Oswin reached for the master ledger. I had already looked at it. I found the relevant entry, identified the recording error, and suggested a correction. The woman looked at me, at my plain gray kirtle and my workday braid, with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of where help was likely to come from. "Thank you, my lady," she said. It hit differently this time. Not strange, as it had when Edric said it on the road. It landed somewhere closer to real. I was walking back through the main corridor toward the east wing that evening when I nearly stepped directly into Roman. He had come from the direction of the war chamber, carrying a rolled parchment, his fur mantle back across his shoulders against the indoor cold of stone walls in winter. We both stopped. The corridor was narrow here, and stopping meant being closer than the formal distances of the Great Hall or the council chamber, close enough that I was immediately, overwhelmingly aware of the height difference, the warmth radiating from him in the way particular to Lycans, the blue of his eyes at this distance and in this torchlight, which was not the winter water color, but something considerably more complicated. "You attended the petitions," he said. "Oswin was behind," I said. "I know how to keep records." "You corrected an error in the harvest ledger." "It was a simple transposition. The numbers were clear once." "Clara." My name, in his voice, with that weight he put into it, unhurried, direct, as though the name itself were something worth saying properly. It stopped me mid-sentence. "I am not questioning it," he said. "I am noting it." A pause. Neither of us moved. "Cressida spoke to you," he said. "Not a question." "In the corridor after the council, yes." "What did she say?" I considered how much to offer. "She said the court has gone without feminine authority for 7 years, and there are matters that have fallen through the spaces between advisors." I met his eyes. "She told me not to let them make me into furniture." Something in Roman's expression shifted. That fractional movement I had catalogued twice before, the one that arrived and departed too quickly to fully name. This time it lasted a heartbeat longer. "Sound advice," he said. "She is a sound woman. She is the sharpest mind on the council, and the only one who says what she means before being asked." He paused. "She did not speak to Seraphine." The name settled between us, not unkindly, but with the particular weight of an unspoken thing finally taking up its space. "She hadn't met Seraphine," I said. "No," Roman said, "but she had a month to form expectations." A pause. "She spoke to you the same day you arrived." I did not know how to answer that, or whether answering was what the moment required. The torchlight moved between us, and outside the corridor window the night had settled fully over the ridge, the pines invisible now against the dark. "He is telling you something," I thought, very quietly, in that honest interior room that had no lock. "He is telling you something without saying it plainly. The way people do when saying it plainly would require more trust than they have yet built." Roman looked at me for one more moment. Then, very carefully, as though offering something he had considered for some time and decided to risk. "There is a library in the North Tower, the upper room. Most of the household has forgotten it exists." He paused. "The records from the eastern border conflicts are there, incomplete. The treaty terms with 3 of the village councils are there as well, and they have not been reviewed in 6 years. I understood. I will look at them, I said. He nodded once. He walked past me down the corridor, close enough that the edge of his fur mantle brushed my shoulder. Briefly, barely, the contact of a single second. He did not look back. I stood in the corridor for a long moment after his footsteps had faded, one hand pressed lightly to the place where the warmth of that brief contact still lingered against my arm. Don't, I told myself, in the firm voice I had been developing for exactly these occasions. But the honest room inside me had already answered. Too late. The North Tower Library smelled of dust and cold stone, and the particular stillness of rooms that hold knowledge no one has thought to ask for in a long time. I went there the following morning before the petition hall opened, carrying a candle and the small ink pot and quill I had borrowed from Oswin's supply. The staircase was narrow and uneven, the steps worn smooth in the center by decades of feet that no longer climbed them. At the top, a low wooden door opened into a room not much larger than my chamber, its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves of scrolls and bound volumes. A single window facing east, letting in the pale winter light. I set my candle on the reading table and began. The Eastern Border records were exactly as Roman had described. Incomplete, fragmented, covering 3 conflicts in partial accounts that contradicted each other in small but significant ways. The village council treaties were worse. 6 years of amendments recorded in 4 different hands with no consistent system. Clauses added in margins, dates that did not align. It was the administrative equivalent of a structure with no foundation, still standing purely through the stubbornness of its materials. I worked through the morning, then through midday, pausing only when Finn appeared in the doorway with bread and a wedge of hard cheese, and the particular grin of someone who had been sent rather than come voluntarily. He noticed you missed the morning meal, Finn said, setting the food on the edge of the reading table and peering at the scrolls with open curiosity. He didn't say that directly, obviously. He told Berta the North Tower was cold and that someone should bring provisions. Finn picked up the edge of one scroll, read 3 lines, and set it down. This is incomprehensible. It is at first, I said. Sit down and I'll show you the pattern. He sat. I showed him. He was faster than I expected, sharp beneath the cheerful exterior, with an instinct for numbers that surprised him as much as it surprised me. We worked together for another hour, Finn asking questions that were better than he knew, and by the time the afternoon bells rang, I had a clear accounting of every gap in the record and a preliminary structure for correcting it. I brought the summary to Roman that evening. Not through Gregor or Oswin or any formal channel. I simply went to the war chamber, knocked, and went in when he answered. He was at his desk, a wide table covered in maps and dispatches, 2 candles burning low, the fur mantle across his chair rather than his shoulders. He looked up when I entered. I set the folded parchment on the edge of his table. The Eastern records, I said. A summary of the gaps and a proposed correction method. The village treaty amendments are listed separately. 3 of the clauses have legal contradictions that would cause problems if challenged. Roman unfolded the parchment. He read it in silence, with the focused attention of someone who reads to understand, rather than to confirm what they already believe. I stood and waited. After a long moment, he set it down. You did this in 1 day, he said. Finn helped. Finn has never voluntarily read an administrative record in his life. He is more capable than he performs, I said. He simply hasn't been asked the right way. Roman looked at me, then at the parchment, then at me again. Clara, he said, in the voice that put weight on my name. Sit down. I sat in the chair across from his desk, the advisor's chair, worn leather, angled toward the candlelight. He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the desk, looking at the parchment in the particular way of someone composing something they have been composing for longer than this moment. "The council will meet again in 3 days," he said. "I want you present, not as a formality, as a member." A pause. "Cressida has already requested it." I absorbed this carefully. "The other advisors will adjust," he said, with the flat certainty of a man who had never encountered an adjustment that did not eventually occur. Roman. His name again, arriving before the careful version of me could redirect it. "Why?" He looked up. "Why this?" I pressed gently. "The library, the council seat. You could have settled the treaty formality and kept me in the East Wing chamber for the winter. It would have been simpler." The candlelight moved between us. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge, pressing against the tower stones with a low, persistent sound. Roman was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then, "The night you arrived," he said, "when the cart came through the gate." He paused. "I heard you before you stepped down, before Gregor made the introduction, before I had any reason to form an opinion." I waited. "You were telling yourself to keep going," he said. "Not in the way people perform courage for an audience. In the way people speak to themselves when no one is listening and they genuinely do not know if they can do the thing they have promised to do." He looked at the candle. "I have heard a great deal of thought in my lifetime, Clara. Most of it is noise, calculations of advantage, performances of feeling, surface arrangements." A pause, quieter. "Yours was not noise. The room was entirely still." "You heard me being terrified," I said. "I heard you being honest," he said. "In a place where honesty costs something." He met my eyes. "I have not encountered that often enough." I thought about what Berta had said, like still water over stone. I thought about everyone in this court who had learned to flatten their minds into smoothness in his presence, turning themselves into surfaces rather than depths, because depth was dangerous when the king could see into it. I thought about what it must be like to spend years surrounded by that smoothness, hearing everything and understanding nothing real. That is, I thought, very quietly, extraordinarily lonely. Roman's expression shifted, not sealed away this time. The shift moved toward me rather than away from it, something opening in his face that I did not have a name for yet but recognized the shape of, the way you recognize something you have been hoping for before it fully arrives. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." Answering my thought directly, openly, without pretending he had not heard it. Something in my chest came undone in a very quiet way. "Then perhaps," I said carefully, "you should stop being alone in it." The silence that followed was the kind that contains more than silence. Warm, weighted, full of something being decided without words. The way the most important decisions are always made. Roman reached across the desk and very slowly set his hand over mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration with witnesses. Simply his hand, warm and steady over mine. An anchor point, a beginning, a question answered before it was asked. I turned my hand over beneath his and held it. We were married before the winter solstice turned to Candlemas, not the elaborate ceremony the court had envisioned for Seraphine. No procession of noble guests from 3 territories, no 7-day celebration, no performance of grandeur. Roman asked me what I wanted, and I told him plainly. The great hall, the household assembled, the word spoken once and meant. He looked at me for a long moment after I said it, and then said, "Good," with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been hoping for exactly that answer. Finn stood at Roman's left, and cried with the unself-conscious openness of someone who had decided dignity was less important than sincerity. Cressida stood at mine, iron circlet level, expression composed, though I saw her press her lips together once during the vows in a way that suggested something was happening behind her composure that she had chosen not to share. Berta wept openly, and did not apologize for it. Gregor, standing in the back of the hall, allowed himself one slow nod, the satisfied expression of a man whose unlikely errand had produced an unlikely outcome he had quietly hoped for. The words were spoken. Roman's hand held mine, steady, certain, through all of them. The months that followed were not without difficulty. 2 of the advisors required substantial patience before accepting my presence at the council table as something other than a temporary accommodation. The village treaty revisions I had identified took 4 months to properly negotiate and record. There was a border dispute in the east that occupied Roman and Gregor for 6 weeks in the early spring, during which I managed the petition hall alone and made decisions I was not entirely certain I had the authority to make, and made them anyway because they needed making. Roman returned to find 17 resolved disputes, 2 corrected land allocation records, and Hesse's family properly compensated from the winter grain stores. He stood in the petition hall doorway, road-worn and quiet, and looked at everything I had done. Then he looked at me. "Clara," he said. "You were gone a long time," I said. He crossed the room and held me, briefly, in the uncomplicated way of someone returning to the place they mean when they say home. No performance in it, no careful distance. Simply present. "I heard you," he said quietly, against my hair. "When I was in the east. Your thoughts sometimes, when it was very quiet." A pause. They kept me steady. I held on. Outside, the spring light was finally reaching the courtyard, pale and new, touching the gray stones with the tentative warmth of something that had taken a long time to arrive and intended to stay. The court of Caerwyn did not become a different place overnight. It became something better slowly, the way most things worth having are built, through accumulated small decisions and choices made by imperfect people, trying to do what the moment required. Roman did not stop being contained, but the stillness in him changed quality. Less sealed, less alone. He laughed eventually. Not often, and not for performance, but genuinely, at real things, in the way that laughter sounds when it has been kept waiting long enough to mean something. Finn grew into his sharpness, and took a seat on the Eastern Council before his 20th year, which he claimed was entirely his own achievement, and which everyone who had sat with him in the North Tower Library knew was not entirely true. Cressida remained the sharpest mind at the table, and said so regularly, and was not wrong. And I, Clara Valen, second daughter, the one no one had thought to save a seat near the fire, learned that belonging is not something granted by the people around you. It is something you build, with your own hands, from whatever materials are given, in whatever place you find yourself standing. I had found myself standing in a castle of dark stone at the edge of a winter forest, wearing a borrowed gown, thinking too loudly in front of a king who could hear every word. I decided exactly where I was meant to be, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.